the genesis of Homo sapiens and our extraterrestrial DNA, the mysteries of ancient history, such as how the Great Pyramid was built and by whom and why, have been well established over the past 4 decades. Similar archaeological enigmas litter the landscape around the planet, and they raise many difficult questions about the origin of human civilization. Eric von Daniken's series of books, which began with Chariots of the Gods, presented archaeological evidence while recounting many mythological traditions that have gods, quote unquote, arriving on Earth from a distant world and bringing technology and the arts of civilized life to primitive human tribes. Many writers followed von Daniken's lead. An entire school of alternative historical thought called the ancient astronaut theory emerged over the years. This school must be distinguished from another branch largely defined by such writers as Graham Hancock, which we can sum up as the Lost Civilization School. The latter does not figure into this discussion, nor is it covered in my book, The Genesis Race, because it never really addresses the issue of the ultimate origins of man or civilization. Even if you accept the idea ancient Egypt and Sumer had their origins in Atlantis, who created that civilization and from what precursors? The essential questions the author has been studying over the past 3 decades are: 1. How did life originate and evolve on Earth? And 2. How did civilization suddenly emerge from mankind's primitive roots? To my mind, it seems the ancient astronaut theory could be defeated if Darwin's theory proved to be correct, which official science claims it has been. That premise can just be justified using several valid arguments. The ancient astronaut theory generally includes the idea summed up in the first chapter of Genesis, which indicates the gods, quote unquote, genetically engineered a proto-human race. The actual verse reads, quote, "Let us make man in our image," end quote. If Darwinism is accurate, then this assertion would be untrue, and the notion of cosmic intervention by an advanced race would fall apart. The second reason is Darwin's theory has not only been applied to biology, it's also used to explain the emergence and development of human civilization by a process referred to as cultural evolution. At its core, Darwinism is based on a simple concept. Life evolves slowly via a process of incremental adaptations to a wide variety of external stimulus. He applied it to biology, and anthropologists, archaeologists, and historians applied the same principles to culture and human history. If this is correct, then we should not find any abrupt transformations in human evolution, quote unquote, either biological or historical. I reason that if Darwinism is accurate, then there may not be any valid scientific basis for the ancient astronaut theory, which posited intervention and rapid-fire metamorphosis in both the biological and historical spheres. The results of this research proved surprising. Darwinism is not only unproven, it has been shown by scientists to be fatally flawed. This is where my book, The Genesis Race, begins. Chapter 2 and 3 clearly show the flaws in the theory of evolution. It has failed exactly where Darwin feared it might, in the fossil record. Here we find, instead of widespread confirmation, a large number of missing links. The general public is given to believe the only missing link in the fossil record exists between apes and man. That's not true. The fossil record contains hundreds of gaps between ancient and modern plant and animal species. Darwin referred to the gap separating the primitive non-flowering plants, gymnosperms, and the flowering plants, angiosperms, as the abominable problem. Why? Because the gymnosperms, like ferns, existed for billions of years, and they still exist today. The angiosperms, like roses, appeared on the scene about 150 million years ago, and they still exist today. Where is the evidence showing the fern evolved through a series of slow, incremental changes into a rose? According to Darwinism, the angiosperm evolved from the gymnosperms. If this is true, then where are the intermediate forms linking the two very different types of plants? They have not been found in the fossil record, and none exist today. This seems impossible, and it is if you accept the principles of Darwinism. This is no scientific explanation. There is no scientific explanation for the lack of intermediate plants linking the ancient and modern types. In fact, there should be millions of such fossils, since they would have been evolving for hundreds of millions of years, far longer than flowering plants. Scientists have also no explanation why gymnosperms and angiosperms exist side by side. Somehow, all the intermediate plants, they say, connect the two kingdoms mysteriously vanished from the fossil record and became extinct. Logic would indicate that the older, ancient plants, the non-flowering, should have been the ones to go the way of extinction. This is actually enough evidence to kill Darwinism. Official science would have us believe the only dissenters against Darwinism are creationists that come from the ranks of the religious right. However, I present numerous references to bona fide scientists that slam the door on Darwin's theory of natural evolution. What is, or should be, of great interest to anyone interested in the pursuit of science as it applies to getting to the truth of human origins and the emergence of civilization are the works of Francis Crick and Fred Hoyle. While von Daniken's books were becoming popular in mainstream culture, these two eminent scientists wrote books about the origins of life on Earth. Both were highly critical of Darwinism and posited that life did not originate on Earth. They said the seeds of the biosphere originate in the cosmos. In his book Life Itself, Crick, a Nobel Prize winner and the co-founder of The Shape of the DNA Molecule, claimed an advanced civilization transported the seeds of life to Earth in a spacecraft. Hoyle, an astronomer who gave the world the steady-state theory of the universe, proposed that life came from the stars, born on comets, or riding on the currents of light waves. The unfortunate thing is, these rigorous scientific arguments were largely dismissed or completely ignored by official science, and also overlooked by the same folks embracing von Daniken's relatively unscientific yet popular approach. Eric did not make people question and think. I want to clarify what I mean by that statement. Von Daniken claimed he was presenting a theory, yet the title of his book ended with a question mark. A new theory is normally offered by presenting arguments against the currently accepted theory, as Crick and Hoyle did, and it is presented assertively with equal measures of humility and confidence that do not end in a question mark. His somewhat insecure and uncritical approach has characterized much of the ancient astronaut literature, which officially science finds easy to debunk. That is why the Genesis race begins with a serious critique of Darwinism. That's followed by several chapters re-examining the account of human genesis and the early history found in the Bible. A revolutionary analysis of the first 3 chapters clearly shows there were 2 creation events of life and mankind on Earth. It also shows the history given in the Bible agrees with the findings of paleontology and anthropology. In the first chapter, we find that an early proto-human race was created and lived in the wilderness, like other animals, as hunter-gatherers. They were given, quote, every green thing to eat, end quote, by the gods, and Genesis 1 ends with that covenant. However, in the second chapter, we are told Adam is created to be a gardener and Eve is taken from Adam's rib in the gods, and the gods, quote unquote, give them clothing and self-awareness. The chronological account of creation in the second chapter is entirely different than that of the first chapter of Genesis. This is a critical point. Not only do the 2 accounts differ completely, we find Adam is not to live in the wilderness as an animal, but is intended to be a caretaker and farmer. If the 2 accounts are compared side by side, the difference is obvious. Adam and Eve are not equivalent to the race created in Genesis 1, and Genesis 2 and 3 are not a detailed elucidation of the events described in the first chapter, which is normally implied or taught in church Bible classes. What the first 3 chapters of Genesis actually describe are 1. The creation of a proto-human race, the pre-Neanderthals and Neanderthals who lived as hunter-gatherers in an innocent state as described in chapter 1, followed by 2. The genesis of modern Homo sapiens, Adam, fit for the agricultural revolution. That is exactly the history given in Genesis, and it agrees with everything modern science establishes about the chronology of human prehistory. This is a radical revision, given much stronger support to the biblical version of human genesis and how and why the agricultural revolution took place. It also clarifies who the us refers to when God is abruptly referred to as a plurality that intervenes and genetically alters life on Earth, the Genesis race, and it sets the stage for a presentation of the enigmatic archaeological and additional evidence that further supports the theory of intervention by a technologically advanced extraterrestrial race. Archaeology has never even addressed all these questions raised by the sudden emergence of agriculture and highly advanced civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt in the 3rd millennium BC, let alone answer the most critical ones. From the perspective of conventional archaeological and anthropological thinking, the origins of humankind and the emergence of civilization from the Stone Age remain enigmatic. We have incontrovertible proof our ancestors could not have built the Great Pyramid with the tools and methods they possessed. Yet official science simply ignores or tries to explain away many serious questions and issues, such as how the Great Pyramid, the world's largest precision-engineered stone structure, was constructed using only hammers, stones, ropes, manpower, and sledges. However, there are other issues that need to be addressed, and today's genetic research is shedding new light on this field. The implications of several important recent findings seem to have escaped the attention of many independent investigators. Established archaeologists and anthropologists have either ignored or railed against the findings of these controversial DNA studies. I am referring to genetic studies into the origin of the domesticated dog and into the diet of our Paleolithic and early Neolithic ancestors. You may ask, what do the dog and Stone Age dietary habits have to do with solving the enigmas of mankind's ancient past? The answer is everything. Until recently, it was believed dogs, Canis familiaris, came from a variety of wild canines such as wolves, coyotes, dingoes, jackals, etc. But the latest DNA research shows that the wolf alone is the ancestral race of all the dogs. This poses a set of very difficult problems. The first dog would have been a mutant wolf. However, wolves are extremely sensitive to the genetic fitness and strength of each member of the pack. They are constantly testing and establishing a stringent social pecking order, and only the alphas reproduce. So how would a mutant ever have survived and reproduced given the rigors of the pack behavior? No wolves in captivity have produced viable mutants, and geneticists tell us mutants are normally unfit and do not survive. We're faced with a real conundrum. If we pose that early human tribes intervened and bred wolves into dogs, we are faced with an equally impossible scenario. How could primitive humans have known it was possible to selectively breed a wild animal into one possessing only those traits beneficial to them? We take the characteristics of dogs for granted. However, they present us with a profound mystery. A dog is the embodiment of only those wolf traits that people find useful, attractive, and safe. How did genetically illiterate Stone Age humans achieve this feat of genetic engineering? This problem is compounded when we are confronted by evidence from our earliest civilizations showing that Salukis, sighthounds, and the Pharaoh's hound had already been bred in ancient Sumeria and Egypt. How is it possible our ancestors recently emerged from the Stone Age could have successfully engineered purebred lines at the onset of civilization? In addition, dogs are not only temperamentally different than their wild progenitors, they differ physiologically as well. The wild alpha male and female only breed once a year, whereas dogs can breed any time. Wolves shed their winter coats, dogs do not. These diverging physiological characteristics take time to develop, in fact, many generations. Again, how did our ancestors at the onset of civilization accomplish this? This mystery is underscored by the fact that most of the modern dog breeds originated thousands of years ago. Science has not even addressed most of these issues, let alone have the experts satisfactorily explain how wolves became dogs 100,000 years ago, nor have they shown the step-by-step transitions. Purebred dogs just suddenly appeared in the archaeological records as if by magic. This is also true of agriculture and our key cereal and legume crops. Wheat, corn, beans, and rice pose a second set of genetic enigmas. Research into the dietary habits of Stone Age tribes around the globe show our ancient hunter-gatherer ancestors subsisted only on leafy plants and lean muscle meats. This makes perfect sense because these foods were readily available, took little or no time processing, and wild game could be cooked over an open fire. The problem with our grain crops, and they are the basis of civilization, is wild grass seeds are so minuscule, the cost benefit of harvesting them was not in favor of it. They also require harvesting, threshing, and cooking technology since they have to be boiled extensively. This was technology Stone Age man lacked. The reason grains have to be cooked is that the human gut is not adapted to digest wild grains. This makes it very clear the use of wild grass seeds as a primary food source is of recent origin. Our Paleolithic ancestors did not subsist on them. And once again, this poses a set of formidable problems that need to be studied rigorously. If our ancestors did not harvest and eat wild grains, how could they have domesticated and bred the wild species so quickly? Without many generations of trial and error experimentation, accumulating in a vast body of agronomic knowledge and agricultural practices, that would have included genetics and breeding, it's all but impossible to understand how the agricultural revolution was brought about. Official science tries to explain the evolution of nomadic hunter-gatherers into sedentary crop-growing farmers by claiming they discovered crops quite by accident. We're told it happened when a primitive villager tossed a seed-bearing plant into the trash pile and noticed that it sprouted. But that trite tale can hardly explain how they selected the best wild species to use as the basis of agricultural evolution. There are thousands and thousands of potential wild plants that could be turned into agricultural crops. How is it people with very little experience with wild grasses were able to pick the best varieties to breed? This represents a quantum leap. What we are asked to believe is that our ancestors, without much experience in the seminal stage of civilization, were able to select and breed the very best varieties of wild grass species. How do we know this is true? Because we still grow the very crops they supposedly selected, even after 5,000 years of continuous technological and archaeological development. We are asked to suspend disbelief and accept they also constructed the largest precision engineered stone building the world has ever seen, the Great Pyramid of Giza, using only primitive hand tools and back-breaking labor. Something is obviously wrong in this picture. Is it logical to assume our earthly ancestors could or would have thrown together the agricultural revolution and then the entire civilizations of Sumer and Egypt out of the whole cloth? No, it is not, and neither do these suppositions represent sound science. For those of us in the alternative history camp, one of the most fundamental questions we must impress upon the public and upon official science is to ask, where are the antecedents and precedents? The antecedents and precedents. Show us the slow Darwinian stages of development that official history presupposes. How can you explain the sudden appearance of genetically altered food crops and advanced engineering techniques at the onset of human civilization? We need step-by-step documentation and incontrovertible evidence, and it ought to be copious and devoid of missing links, since we are supposedly talking about events that occurred thousands and not tens of hundreds of millions of years ago, as is the case with biological evolution. Where did our Paleolithic ancestors acquire the knowledge and skills to breed wild plants into food crops while also constructing plant cities? How did they achieve an exacting command of the principles of civil engineering as exhibited in Sumeria and the Harappan civilization of the Indus Valley? How did humans go from mud huts and collecting leafy plants to building ziggurats, flush toilets, public bathhouses, as in Mohenjo-Daro, making bread in ovens and inventing processed metallurgy seemingly overnight. In plain language, where is the proof, the missing links, demonstrating your official science theories are confirmed in the archaeological record and meet simple standards of logic and common sense? Turn to what our ancestors in Sumer, Mexico, Egypt, and Peru have to say about the origins of agriculture and civilization. We find a very different story. According to the ancient records written in oral traditions, none of the earliest civilizations claimed they invented it. What is of profound interest is they are in unanimous accord in claiming they were given the arts of civilization by the gods. It is very unlike human nature to give credit to anyone else for anything we have invented or achieved. The ancient Egyptians left copious records of every aspect of their culture in a huge collection of artwork, hieroglyphics, and texts. Yet we find no reference in their 3,000-year history as to how or why they built the pyramids. That's a curious lapse of documentation for such a communicative race, assuming they did indeed build the pyramids. Why they have omitted any reference to their most important monuments. Now, that seems a preposterous supposition, and yet Egyptologists gloss over it, as they do the lack of mummies in the alleged pyramids as tombs scenario they embrace without blushing. These are all clues, pieces of a vast planetary puzzle telling the story of the Genesis race. The references to these gods, quote unquote, that arrived on Earth to uplift man are described in the Bible and other ancient texts and traditions. Their megalithic calling cards are found in Egypt, Mexico, Peru, and China. The Darwinian-based theories of official science concerning the origin of man and human civilization lead to a series of intellectual dead ends. If we closely examine the record, we find civilization was founded upon 5 primary inventions. 1 is agriculture, 2, urbanization, 3, writing, 4, the wheel, and 5, process metallurgy. Now, what happens when we try to uncover the origins of these key inventions in the archaeological and historical record? We find anthropologists and historians positing that agriculture was probably discovered by accident when our primitive ancestors tossed plants into the garbage heap and noticed the seeds producing new plants. Of course, that does not explain what motivated them to plant and harvest wild grass seeds they almost never ate, and how they learned to selectively breed and alter these plants genetically. Well, they brush aside these queries with some logic, the same logic. This too was probably a serendipitous process that moved forward by a series of benign, happy coincidences. We are given to imagine the first domesticated animal, an example of perfect selective breeding, also took place when Paleolithic tribesmen, via unknown techniques, domesticated a line of mutant wolves. When we learn that process metallurgy too was a result of an accident, then someone dropped a piece of malachite into a campfire and observantly noticed that as it melted, it produced copper. In short, the fundamental paradigm official science has formulated on how human life originated and how we created civilization rests on a series of miraculous accidents and impossible knowledge and skills. Egyptologists would have us believe that primitive tribes living along the Nile in oval huts who used mud bricks to build mastabas for millennia were suddenly capable of advanced quarry operations, stonemasonry, architecture, and corporate engineering. Of course, they cannot explain how these primitive people built a massive, precision-engineered pyramid using only round hammers, wooden sledges, and human labor. The Egyptians could not have built it, did not build it, and never claimed they were the pyramid's creators. It is simply not possible to quarry, lift, drag, and transport 70-ton blocks of granite 500 miles from the Aswan quarry in Giza and up 150 vertical feet and precisely position them in the king's chamber as Egyptologists claim was done. I have repeatedly challenged Egyptologists and their irrational, unscientific fellow travelers to demonstrate how the blocks of granite in the king's chamber can be quarried and lifted out of the quarry bed and transported using the primitive tools and methods they claim were used, and it cannot be done. Furthermore, this author claims he can show that any academics, mathematicians, anthropologists, and/or engineering professors who believed and teach these absurdities to students are lunatics running the asylums, our scientific institutions and universities. It is certainly a serious, bold indictment, and yet it must be made because it is true, and it is high time to expose the intellectual chicanery and fraud perpetrated upon generations. I am not making these claims to create a controversy, but to resolve a long-standing debate that has profound ramifications since it involves eliminating falsehoods and getting to the historical facts. How can I make such strong accusations with complete confidence? First, the author has studied the engineering problems intensively and extensively compared the building of modern-day monuments using state-of-the-art technology to the construction of the Great Pyramid using primitive tools and methods. Second, I have examined the recent record of tests conducted by Egyptologists and others trying to prove they could quarry, move, and lift blocks of stone using nothing but ancient tools and techniques. Both studies yielded the same results. The Great Pyramid could not have been built with hammerstones, sledges, and ramps. One test, filmed by Nova, was organized by Egyptologist Mark Lerner and involved leading experts in a variety of fields. The team set out to quarry, move, and lift a 35-ton obelisk into place. They failed miserably at every step. The master stonemason could not quarry the block using the primitive tools he was given. A cat was called in to quarry the block and lift it onto a flatbed truck, the caterpillar, that is. Sensing defeat, they never even tried to transport it. Using a wooden sledge, the block was half the weight of one of those used in the king's chamber. A Nissan-funded Japanese team conducted another serious test in 1978. They set out to build a small-scale duplicate of the Great Pyramid, also using the primitive tools and techniques that Egyptologists claim the ancients employed. The group was confident they could demonstrate how it was done. However, when they tried to quarry the blocks, they found the hammerstones were not equal to the task. They called in pneumatic jackhammers. When they tried to ferry the blocks across a river on a primitive barge, they sank. They called in a modern tugboat for help. And then they loaded a block onto a sledge, only to find that it stubbornly sank into the sand when they tried to drag it into the site. They called for trucks and loaders. The final coup de grace was delivered when they were forced to call in helicopters to lift and position the blocks into place. Even using modern technology, the Japanese team found, to their utter embarrassment, they could not bring the apex of their tiny 60-foot-tall replica together. They suffered bitter and quite humbling defeat in the unforgiving Egyptian desert. Their replica of the Great Pyramid turned out to be a total joke. We're supposed to believe men using tools marginally better than Stone Age equipment quarried, lifted, hauled millions of blocks of stone to form a precision-engineered 4-million-ton tomb. Stuff of nonsense. The conventional scenario is not just an absurd proposition that can only be maintained using intellectual smoke and mirrors. It's downright silly. The real question is, how could anyone with any common sense have ever believed this? There are, of course, many other problems in the primitive tools and methods scenario and the Great Pyramid. To begin with, Mark Lerner commissioned an engineering firm to study the site. They found that the 13-acre base had been leveled with an accuracy equal to that achieved by modern-day lasers. They were to believe a 13-acre limestone bench was planed with that degree of precision using round hammerstones to grind down the rock until it was almost perfectly flat. Furthermore, the descending passage was actually the next phase of this massive construction project. It too had to be dug out of solid bedrock. The problem with this phase of the project was manifold. The passageway was only about 3 to 4 feet, just large enough to accommodate one worker at a time. It was dug 150 feet underground, maintaining a precise angle of 26 degrees and a negligible deviation from side to side and bottom to top throughout the length. Then it was opened up into several rooms and another passageway. But how? Why would the ancients dig a straight tunnel under a 4 million-ton tomb, and how was the passageway kept straight and true? Egyptian engineers had no more than ropes in their toolkits. The author can also prove these two phases alone, leveling the base and digging the descending passageway, would have required half the time Egyptologists had allotted to the entire construction project. They, in fact, never even included these two phases in their calculations. But we have other important fish to fry. During decades of research, the author noted some curious similarities between Sumer, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, the sites of our earliest civilizations. They do not add up. As we all know now, the ruins of Sumer are located in modern-day Iraq. Our history and anthropology books routinely tell us that agriculture and civilization were given birth in benign and highly fertile river valleys. But when we stop and closely examine these locations, we find they're some of the hottest, driest, most inhospitable places on the planet. The temperature in these locations for 6 months out of the year are typically between 35 and 48 degrees Celsius. That's 95 to 118 degrees Fahrenheit. It's true the alluvial floodplains of the Nile, Tigris, Euphrates, and ancient Indus rivers were fertile, but it takes considerable agronomic and hydrological knowledge to know this and to convert the marshes and control the floods to turn these wetlands into productive farmland. The question is, how did our ancient ancestors, so recently emerged from the hunter-gatherer way of life, so quickly acquire this knowledge and develop these skills? When we peer out from the ziggurats of ancient Sumer, the sand-blasted pyramids of Egypt, or the ruined cities of the Indus valleys, we do not see fruited plains, but vast blistering desert expanses. Is it not difficult to envision our primitive ancestors rolling out their blueprints for civilization while squinting into the sun and deciding this is where the first cities and great monuments would be built and the first real cropland cultivated? The scenario jars the mind and makes hash out the comfortable fantasies painted by official science, quote unquote. Is something starting to smell to smell funny, or is the author's nose just too sensitive? I do seem to detect the subtle aroma of too many skeletons and enigmas having been shoved hurriedly into too many closets and musty catacombs wafting up from ancient stones and bones. We have to examine several other items that do not pass the smell test. Sumer, Egypt, the Indus Valley share some other critical features in common which make them unlikely places for primitive people to have developed our first civilizations. We should expect to find civilizations evolving where people had immediate access to a wide variety of resources. The most logical scenario would be in river valleys near forested, mineral-rich mountains. This is a logical expectation since people needed water, fuel for wood, for fires, tool handles and building materials, as well as copper, gold, and silver to make jewelry and tools and so on. We would expect to find this association not just to establish they had immediate access to these necessary resources, but also that they had been engaged in a prolonged period of extracting, processing, and working with these resources. Unfortunately, Sumer, the birthplace of civilization, was completely lacking in forests, minerals, and even stones. This is a curious, illogical fact. How did this strange tribe, speaking an odd language and calling themselves the black-headed people, quote unquote, invent civilization in the middle of a barren desert wasteland? Egypt was also bereft of forests, as was the Indus Valley. The point is not that civilization was or is impossible in these areas, but that it is supposed to have originated in these harsh desert environs lacking many basic resources. Yet we find the Sumerians ingeniously mining copper and tin, creating the first alloy, bronze, in kilns around 3000 BC. In rapid fire succession, they invented the wheel, the chariot, the sailboat, writing, cities, labor specialization, civil engineering, and so on and on and on. Ostensibly, the tribes of the Indus Valley and the Nile would soon follow. They did all this while most of the world's tribes were still living as hunter-gatherers, another fact that demolishes the theories of cultural Darwinists. You cannot explain the radical departure from the human norm by several tribes without invoking some form of racism or inexplicable genetic deviations. The other curious features we found in common among Earth's first quote-unquote civilizations are that none of them claimed they invented agriculture, laws, morality, or the other prime tools of civilization. The Sumerians claimed they owed everything to the gods, the Anunnaki, that had descended from heavens to earth to create and teach mankind the arts of civilized life. The ancient Egyptians referred to the Nefertu, who ruled over them during the Zep Tepi the first time, for thousands of years until they handed over the reins to the human pharaohs. Our real human history, as handed down by our ancestors, is far more exciting and incredible than the pabulum official science that has been force-fed to us for many generations. Mankind is indeed on the threshold of a reawakening to a new dawn. The time of profound revelations about the truth of our astonishing origins and history is at hand. And this is by Will Hart, New Dawn magazine, and it's on Humans Are Free, Creative Commons by Alexander Light. If you'd like to join me on my Patreon account, you will hear content not covered by mainstream media. These riveting stories will be based on my research, and I will state my opinions and give my personal insight on diverse and controversial subjects and world events not covered by mainstream media, and not supported by YouTube guidelines. So whatever I have on my Patreon, most of those will not be on my YouTube channel. Please consider becoming a member today. More of the most significant and important videos will be on my Patreon channel. Your support helps me to continue my research and keeps this YouTube channel alive. And we depend on your support, your generous charity, because we help economically challenged families here in Athens, Greece, in Kapota, and we also help the young generation with university tuition and the community around our church. Thank you.